And in this section, what we're going to talk about is, okay, so what do we do with all this stuff we're learning? And how do we start experimenting and living it out and trying it? And as we do that, Pastor James and I are actually going to do like a conversation. And he's going to share with you how he got connected with some of this stuff and what he's starting to try. And so we'll have a conversation. I'm going to ask him some questions. He'll ask me some questions. And then you're free to ask questions as well. But I think that's going to be super helpful, because I think otherwise sometimes what happens is you're like, man, that's a bunch of great ideas, but could we really do that? And after spending time with Pastor James, the answer is yes, you can do that, and probably a lot more stuff you didn't realize you can do. So he'll share that with you directly so that you guys can hear some of that. And we're going to talk about microgroups and this concept of microchurch and how it fits into the bigger structure of church and stuff like that. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's one of those instances where we save the best for last. Yeah. So go ahead, grab some coffee, and we'll step into our next session after that. We're going to round up for this last session where we'll wrap everything up nice and neatly, and no. This is really fun. We entitled this one, "Where Do We Go From Here?" And so that's always the question after an experience like this is where do we go from here? So maybe to understand where we go from here, we should probably just start with how we got here.
Sounds good to me.
So tell us how you got connected with this and what made you want to do like the Missionary Pathway journey.
It started a few years ago, before the pandemic, and I was at a stage in my ministry where I was floundering. It felt like I was kept trying to come up with ideas that I would throw against the wall and see if they would stick, and most of them didn't. And we had conversations with our leadership, and what we put before the congregation, and the congregation agreed to do, was to send me on something called PLI, the Pastoral Leadership Institute. So that's about a 2.5-year program, and Susan and I both went, and it was just so wonderful and life-giving, and it helped me to stop that floundering that I was doing, and failing at wildly successfully, I might add. And so with PLI, we'd have a coach that would meet with everybody in our cohort online once a month. And I actually don't know how I got connected with the Kairos Network, but I think what happened is our coach, John Carley, sent out some kind of information from the Kairos Network, and I got on the mailing list. And then last summer, there was emails that were sent out about 2 courses that the Kairos Network was offering. One was on preaching, which I signed up for, and the other one was the Missionary Pathway. And so as part of that first cohort, and Leonardo Neitzel, who's also in the Lower Mainland, was in that group. And it was funny, one time, you weren't there, but one of our meetings, there was Trey, who was in Houston, and I was in Langley, and Leonardo was in Mexico. So we had all of North America covered by the 3 of us. So
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's amazing how God like lines that stuff up. So what stuck out to you? Because you had 2 opportunities. You had the preaching opportunity, but you also had this Missionary Pathway thing. What made you want to go the Missionary Pathway direction?
PLI was really helpful. One of the nuggets that I got out of PLI was the strategic visioning process, which our church did in 2019, 2020, and that strategic vision that I mentioned on Friday night, that came out of that process, and some of the people that were on that visioning team are here today. But it was kind of a what next. So out of our plan, we wanted to be a blessing not only to the people of our church, not only to the people of our community, but to the Lutheran Church Canada churches in the Lower Mainland. And so part of our strategic vision that we formed in March of 2020, right before the pandemic, and I shared that story with you of how that went down, was to have a regional conference. And so I was looking for something like the next steps. And so going through the Missionary Pathway, I think kind of opened the door to what those next steps can be. Because we're living in an area which is the most unchurched area in all of Canada. And so it's a real challenge. And congregations are going through a tough time, not only because of that, but because of some of the things that are happening in our culture, and then some of the things that happened during the pandemic as well. When we got shut down for an extended period of time, people changed their habits. And so how do we have this so important, life-giving, in an eternal sense message. How do we share that with people, given where God has put us? And I think that that's what I was kind of looking for going into the Missionary Pathway, and I think that's what I found. And so then we wanted to get you up here.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to share it with other people. And as our leadership met, it was like, oh, we could have Matt, you and I talked about the different ways it could be shared. We could do it online. We could do it like a weekly, once a week. And one of our leaders, who's on camera too, said, I really don't have time in my schedule for one more thing on a weeknight. But if he comes up here for a weekend, and she also said, I think it'd be better if he came in person, because we would have more, there'd be more impact. If he came up here for a weekend, I would definitely make time for that.
Wow.
So even though, so it was like, and then we shared it with our governing board and our congregation. They're like, yeah, let's do this thing. We were planning to do it in 2028. Why wouldn't we do it in 2023?
Yeah. Drag it forward a little bit.
Yeah.
That's good.
Who knows? We can do it again, right? So that's how that all happened.
I love that. So it's fun hearing that side of the story. I want to share the other side of the story, because I think sometimes we engage with experiences like this, and I think a few people have asked. They're like, yeah, so how many of these have you done? Where do you go? Well, this is the first one. Thanks. But I think the fun thing about mission is, like, I've learned over the years, one of the biggest hurdles to mission is just our fear of trying that first time. And actually where our network came out was a really similar journey. Because something I hear in James' journey, it's like sometimes you hear James saying, I just had to take the next right step. Like, I didn't have it all figured out, but it's just about the next right step. Well, for us as a network, it was the same thing. I ended up coming up to New Jersey. Didn't know where New Jersey was, by the way. The district president at the time, our church plant finally was in a place where, like, we had multiple staff, we were much more stable. It was the time where you're supposed to sit back and just enjoy it, right? And we were training some church planters, and I got this random email from the district president in New Jersey, who's like our area pastor, and he goes, would you ever consider coming out to New Jersey? And I replied back, where is New Jersey? And so I said, if you fly me up and we could see it, let's do it. And so I flew up, and I got to see this area that's a lot like Vancouver in the sense of it's incredibly disconnected from faith, very post-Christian, especially when you're coming from the South, where our mother church was on a street. Imagine a street filled with mega churches. Like, and our mother church, being like 600 something in worship on a Sunday, was the little church on the street. Okay? And then I go up to New Jersey, and it's like, if there's a big church, it's like very big and old, and you can tell it's not full at all. And there wasn't a church on every corner. And so I was very intrigued by that. And so we came up, and we took over an existing church, and then we launched out this church planting network. But what I started learning up there was how hard it was to get pastors to take calls to an area like that was very expensive, not an area people were from, and very post-Christian. And we were planting some churches, but I realized the cost of that was really high. And then I started looking, like we said, out at all these people. I'm like, man, what would it look like if we started training planters? Well, then the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, every church in America was trying to figure out what we already knew how to do in a weekend. So our next right step was to just share a webinar series to help churches learn how to get online. And then through doing that, while God's doing all this other stuff, all of a sudden we get this vision to just, it was time to take the network full time. So we stepped out of the role, and with like, not $0, but as close to $0 as you could get, my friend Trey and I built this out. And then we're like, okay, what do we do now? Like, we should probably start our first cohort. So we threw out an opportunity. We started 2 cohorts, and James was in the first one. And he was in our group that ended up being like a lot of other pastors, which was really fun, because then we would talk Missionary Pathway, but we'd also talk about ministry and how it applied to ministry. And it was just cool to see, one, personally, it was cool to just be in the cohort with James and to get to see how he wrestled through this stuff and then how he would go out and try these things. And that part was just amazing. Like, you know, to see that like desire to be like, well, let's just give it a shot and see what happens. And so when James called up and he's like, so what do you think about doing it over a weekend experience? I was like, I don't know. Let's try it. And this has been amazing. It's been really fun to get to sit down with you and like actually be in context and dream with you about what mission looks like. But I tell you all that, not to pull back the curtain, but I want you to leave here being less afraid to just try. And sometimes when you come to something like this, you're like, they've got it figured out. Like, he does this all the time, right? Like, you got this maybe image of me flying around the country, like just doing this at all these different churches. And that's not the case. Last week, the only thing I was flying around was my kids around town, trying to get them into their various sports and then trying to work in between, right? So I think when you take those gospel risks, you get to see God do some really cool stuff. So we want to encourage you, don't be afraid to just try. Because you never know what will happen if you just step out and try. We had, at our church plant in Knoxville, we would always try things, and we'd call them experiments. And here's why we call them experiments. If you call something a program, it's like all of a sudden it has to succeed, right? And if it doesn't work, people are very hesitant to try anything else like that again, because that was the program that was supposed to work. But an experiment's different, right? Because when we say we're going to do an experiment, we automatically from the outset think what? Maybe it succeeds, maybe it fails, right? We hold on to it a little more loosely. But here's what I've learned about experiments. I stole this from Craig Rochelle, who wrote it in a book called It. When you call something an experiment, if it fails, people are like, okay, experiments fail. But if it succeeds, you get all the same benefits as if you called it the program that was supposed to succeed without the downside. And so we just started calling everything an experiment and trying that. And what I started learning was people were a lot more willing to try things when they called it an experiment. And so do those gospel experiments. Sometimes they're going to take off. They're going to be amazing. And those are the things that people write books about, right? And share at conferences. But what you don't often hear are the really cool failures. And so here was one of our favorite failures at the point. We decided we would start a second campus when we were only 1 year into being a church. We were not that big. Like, we were just about maybe 100 at worship at some point. And I'm like, let's do a second campus. And everybody's like, yeah, let's do it. So we had free access to a Thai restaurant that was closed on Sunday afternoons. And it was right by the University of Tennessee, which is a major university. And we knew our worship style really appealed to younger people. They were coming out. We're like, so of course it's going to work at the college. So we did none of the same missional work that we did when we planted the church. We just showed up and said, if we do the same thing here, it'll work. Raised money to help do it. It was an epic failure. It drained me on Sundays because I was doing stuff in the morning, and then I'd go at night and try and do it again. It drained our team because we didn't have a core of volunteers that was helping. And we started out with a bunch of people coming, and then it just started dwindling down until finally we just closed it after one semester, right? So like 4 or 5 months. Epic failure. But here's what I learned. I learned more failing doing that than I think I would have if it succeeded. Because we got to see somebody baptized in a Thai restaurant. So the one thing you need to learn is that even when something fails with the gospel, it can radically succeed because of Jesus, right? And the other thing we learned what not to do, which all of a sudden made the bar church thing that took off radically successful, because we saw all those mistakes and we said, let's not do that again. So the other reason I tell you not to be afraid to try is because sometimes in your failures, you will learn the things you need to learn that will allow the next thing to be even more successful. But even in your failure, you can still see people come to faith. And it's a really cool thing.
So if you fail, you just tie again?
Yeah. So true. Oh, I love it. So, transition. So James and I were talking, when you all were discussing, James and I would sometimes discuss. It was fun. And one of the things we were talking about is, I said, is there anything we haven't talked about that we did in the actual session that you're like, I want us to definitely get to talk about that? And James brought up, I really want to talk about the micro group and micro church stuff, and especially how it applies here. So first I would ask you, what do you think is so critical about that conversation for our context here, and how you see it fitting into the bigger picture of church and ministry in Walnut Grove Lutheran, but then also in the Vancouver area?
Well, for me, it's an answer of, what next, because the microgroup or the microchurch. So Trey and I had a conversation that you weren't part of. Yeah. So, and he was a huge blessing to me. And so so Matt and I have talked about how they're not coming with, they have all the he's not coming like he has all the answers. Trey would say the same thing. I'm not trying to say that I have all the answers either. So I'm as I was talking with Trey, I was talking with someone who's learning on the go, kind of like I am, but he's he's some steps down the road ahead of me. Yeah. And so that was a huge blessing. And so he shared a few things that, so he's had some failures and some things that worked, and so I was able to glean from that, to learn from that. But basically, the reason I'm so excited about the possibilities with this idea is, like you said, about the discipleship Bible study, because that's part of it. Anybody can do this. And as I look down the road, I don't want to instill fear in people. I don't think we ever need to be afraid. I don't think we ever should make decisions based on fear. But I think we need to be prepared for a future in which things are a lot tougher for the Christian church in the Lower Mainland than they are now. I mean, I can see a time when, and others have shared this. This isn't original with me, but I could see a time when we lose our privileges in terms of property tax forgiveness. I could see where we, lose favorable tax status regarding housing. I could see a time where, maybe we won't be able to afford to have buildings or professional staff. And you know what? They didn't in the first 300 years of the church either, and it grew. And they don't in China right now, and the church is growing. And so with the micro-church model, you can do that with or without a building and professional staff. And so, and the other piece, though, was these two things can exist side by side. And so it's not a matter of, well, we're going to burn down the church and fire our pastor and just do this. No, we're going to do both, and we're just going to see what the Holy Spirit does.
Yes. We want to emphasize you're not going to fire your pastor.
Yeah.
It's very important. I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, I was thinking earlier in the break, I was like, this is something we should talk about to talk about the other thing, which is this idea of modalic and sodalic organizations. And so I drew a picture over here, and what that is this is the idea. So a modalic organization is like a bigger, more established organization, right? And modalic organizations have some real advantages. Modalic organizations tend to have more structure. They tend to have more resources. They're more well established. So there's some advantages to modalic organization. Disadvantages, though, they don't tend to be very flexible. They are slow to change or adapt. And oftentimes they can fall behind very easily because they start to exist. Like they start to exist for the structure, essentially. A really great example of this would be like Kodak. Do you all remember Kodak, the photo giant? Yeah, some of you are like, yes, and some of the youth are like, There was a time where photos weren't digital, right? And Kodak was the king of film, right? But what Kodak forgot was their core business is not film, it's photos. And so as they started stepping into digital, they drug their feet and they didn't step into it. And so they fell behind. That can happen with modalic organizations. Then you've got these other expressions out here. These are what you call sodalic expressions. And sodalic expressions are smaller, more experimental expressions. They're very adaptable and flexible. They tend to pop up in a culture that is, and to navigate the challenges of the culture that is. And sometimes when these things go well, they can grow to be those very big new things. Think about like Facebook. Facebook started out as a modalic organization, right? Like what was it? 15, 16 years ago, something like that. Facebook didn't even exist, and now it's like, one of the global giants, right? It started as this like sodalic experiment. Now, where sodalic organizations have a lot of adaptability and missional flexibility, they lack a lot of the resources and the structure, right? You know this if you've ever worked in a company that's like a startup. Startups can be really fun, but they can also be really taxing, right? Because you're always trying to do more with less. And also, you're always kind of like playing catch up almost. And so we oftentimes think of these things as different, right? But the reality is, if you think about these things not as opposed to one another, but working together, what you begin to see is this beautiful picture of what's possible. So like when modalic organizations support sodalic expressions, they're able to bring structure and resources to something that doesn't normally have structure and resources. And they're actually able to keep these these sodalic organizations from like going off the deep end, right? But sodalic organizations are able to bring adaptability and flexibility to these modalic organizations. So the sodalic can teach the modalic things it wouldn't gain on its own, and it can allow the modalic to adapt a lot faster than it would be able to on its own. So the best example I can think of with this is the pandemic. Before the pandemic, 10% of churches were live streaming. 10%. Like Canada, America, same stats, 10%. Which means what? 90% weren't. Because I was at a church plant, we were in a sodalic organization, we had the freedom to experiment. So one of the things I was experimenting with as early as 2014, 15 was how we could live stream. So how we could move from just recording our services and putting them online to actually recording them live as they were happening. I spent like 2 years trying to figure this out. making mistakes, figuring things out, but really got to spend that 2 years with like no pressure, right? Because people weren't depending on it. They weren't even like looking for it. So we got to just kind of play with it. Fast forward to leaving the church plant and then going to the existing church, the first thing I wanted to do in 2017 was to equip the sanctuary for live stream. And at my 100-year-old existing church, they were like, why? Do we really need that? But I had this whole bank of experimentation at the church plant, and I was able to tell them, hey, it's not just about connecting new people, but then people when they're shut in, people when they're in the hospital, they can still experience it. We put it in, people loved it. Fast forward to 2022, or 2020, what happened? Pandemic. Everything shut down. Like, there was that time where you couldn't come to church, and we were like, is that ever something that could happen? And it just happened. And all of a sudden, for our congregation, even though it was a 100-year-old congregation, all that was for me was an email. Like, hey, everybody, we're on live stream. For 90% of other churches, including a lot of my pastor friends, it was, what in the world do we do? Because some of them hadn't just dragged their feet on going on live stream. They didn't even have like worship services online, period. And now you couldn't gather in person. And I had this like burden in my heart because I was like, you're going to try and figure out in one weekend what I spent 2 years figuring out and trying and failing. So what we did at the network is I called a few friends and I said, hey guys, what would you think if we did a webinar and we'll invite people out? I think we had like 30 people on our email list at that time. And I did some webinars to create content for our training stuff. But nobody would show up to them. I think my mom showed up a couple times. It was one of those things. And they're like, yeah, sure. So in 24 hours notice, we put it together. We had, I think, 57 some people sign up. Within the first 2 weeks, our email list had grown to like 500 some people. Within a couple months, there was like over 1,000. And people would engage, anywhere from like 100 to 300 people would engage on a webinar. And we were able to share with the church all these things that we had learned and help all these pastors and ministry leaders, and let's be honest, pastors' wives who went from pastor wife to camera operator. We helped them start to figure out how to live stream. And so the whole church was blessed because of this natural collaboration, which my church plant wouldn't have existed if there wasn't a mother church that was willing to pour resources into us to start and try this new thing. And so what it becomes, think about it as like train tracks. So like you have two different rails, and those two different rails, while they're on opposite sides, when they work in tandem, allow the train to move forward together, right? Move one of those rails off and the train's not going anywhere. So when we think about modalic and sodalic in the church, think about it like this. Because the reality is, there's a lot of people that are meeting and connecting with Jesus right here in the established form of church. Even though we realize it's not perfect and it might not be structured to meet all the challenges that we have coming before us, there's a lot of people that are connecting with Jesus here, right? So if we just blow this up, is that a good thing? No, in case you're wondering, it's not. Because people are connecting with Jesus. But if this is the only thing, we're in trouble. So what could we do? Well, what if the 80% that are already connecting with Jesus start supporting the 20% who are ready to go out and try some experiments and try church in a different way? And we work together, and all of a sudden what's going to happen is these 20% are going to feel support, so they're not out by themselves, right? And there's different ways they'll feel it. And then ultimately, these 20% are going to start learning things about reaching the culture and the things that are, and they're going to be able to bring those things back. And the church is going to be able to adapt and change where it needs to adapt and change, but it's going to be able to do it in a pace and a timing that's healthy for a bigger modalic organization. And so that's kind of what we're talking about with the micro church and micro group. It's an opportunity to try a whole bunch of gospel experiments that could lead to new innovations in the church.
So, but this isn't your grandfather's Bible study.
This isn't your grandfather's Bible study.
Nope.
No. Yeah.
So what Trey, because it came out of that conversation, what Trey taught me is you start, it's three people. Well, so one person invites a second person, and the second person invites a third person.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do is you don't look for people who you think might need it, but you look for people who are already, I'm struggling for the words, but they're already,
Like open to it?
well, even more than that, they're already walking in faith but looking for more.
Yeah.
I mean, you could. I guess you could start anywhere with anyone who is searching for more.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, I would always start with somebody that's receptive. That could be in or out of faith. And so Trey and I learned this from my mentor, Dave Putman. And Dave is still an Oxano church consultant, passionate about discipleship. So actually that vision process you all went through, my mentor Dave goes around the country and like takes people through that kind of process stuff. And then the pandemic came, everything shut down, and my friend Dave, who's a pastor church planter, is like, had a heart for discipleship and wanted to rethink it. And somebody called him up. I think it was like a pastor in like his 70s called him up and said, hey, I want to do discipleship. We're in the middle of the pandemic. I don't know what to do. Could you help me? And my friend Dave goes, I think I can. Can you give me a week? And the guy goes, okay. So he starts thinking about it and praying about it. And he comes up with this idea of like, well, what if we just met together for these Bible study things? And so the idea seemed to work out on paper to him. So he's like, let me try it. So my friend Dave tried a micro group for the first time. And the two people he invited to the group? His wife and his daughter. So you think that group's not going to go very far beyond that, right? But they started doing discipleship for the first time together and started asking those simple questions. And then all of a sudden, his daughter started doing it with some other moms they were connected to. And then my friend Dave started doing it with some other people from his CrossFit gym. And then his wife started doing it with some other people. And what started happening was it started rippling out. And it was so simple, that same Discovery Bible Study stuff you all were doing, that like it started rippling out beyond him. And now when you see, he's got a little map in the background sometimes that show all the relationships because he kind of like tracks it. And it's all over the place. Now, 2 years later, it's actually becoming a little church network in Atlanta. And they're actually starting to figure out how to meet together and gather like once a month. And it's spreading through his CrossFit gym like crazy. And so what Dave does is he says this. He does it in groups of 3. And what he does is he will invite somebody into it, or somebody will ask him about it. And he says, that's great. You have to invite the other person. And when you invite the other person, we'll meet. And he'll model it for you the first time. And then after that, he always goes last. And they meet in that discipleship huddle, and they just walk through the Gospels. And then the whole time, he challenges those people to be like, you could do this too. Who could you do this with? And so that's how the groups start to multiply out. And one of the reasons they multiply out is because, and you see this in science, but it's really true, the simpler the organism or the system, the easier and faster it is to replicate. So if you talk about multiplying churches, that tends to be slower and longer. But if you're talking about multiplying little discipleship groups like this, it tends to be a lot faster and highly replicable. And so that's kind of where all that came from.
I was really inspired by a story Trey told about a young woman that he met through, was part of his micro church network.
Yeah.
And he was able to baptize her and her kids. Really tough situation that she was in. And Trey was talking to, I don't know if it was his sponsoring church pastor,
Yeah.
And that pastor said, you know, even if she lived right next door to the church, she would never come to our established church, because for her that would be a barrier that was, and we could say a cultural barrier. It was too high. She wouldn't do it, but she came to Trey's backyard, and she became part of God's family through baptism.
It's huge. My friend Trey, he does that. He does worship in his backyard. And the mom that James is talking about, she's got four kids with 3 or 4 different dads, kind of thing. And some of the kids are, you know, just struggle to sit down, to be quiet, to be still. She's a single mom, so she's like, you know, at the end of her rope all the time, right? As far as like trying to manage that. And so you can imagine, sometimes that happens in like a church setting, and it can feel like a disturbance to the bigger worship service, right? But in the backyard, they were able to just connect around Jesus and connect in a way that the kids could connect with, and she didn't feel like they were imposing. And actually, the first time she got connected, she actually just sent the older 2 kids over because they were asking about church. So she sent them over to the micro church by themselves, and they had such a great experience. She's like, all right, I want to come check this out. And so she started coming, and then she was going through some tougher stuff, but then Trey was talking with her about forgiveness and stuff, and he's like, well, he goes, are you baptized? And she goes, no. He goes, well, I can do it if you want. She goes, really? He goes, yeah. My wife and I will come over right now with our kids. So they went over to her house, and he's got video of this. It's such a cool video. And there are her and the 4 kids in the living room. He's got the bowl of water, and he gives them all these little crosses, and he's explaining baptism, and you see the whole family get baptized there. And it's just this beautiful picture of, like, you know, people connecting in faith. Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that can happen when we move outside. And, you know, it happens too. I'll point this out. Like Trey's, the mother church that's helping Trey's plant is a part of a network of other churches that are trying to plant churches, Lutheran churches. They call themselves the Harvest Partnership in Houston area. And, you know, when Trey came down, they thought he would do a large launch church plant, you know, kind of like this was, right? And Trey is the same guy that I said is incredibly gifted at music and stuff like that, right? So you've got the preaching and the worship leader, you're set. But Trey really felt like he should do it in a more discipling style. So he goes out like this, and it would be very easy for the mother church who's funding this, right? Because when you plant churches, it's like having high school / college students. You pour a lot of money in, but a lot of money does not come back, right? And it would be very easy for them to say, no, this is not what we signed up for. We're supporting this. But they said, Trey, if the Holy Spirit's leading you in this direction, this is what we support. And so Trey was able to be a part of that story because he also had a church that was willing to support him doing that, and was willing to partner with it even though it didn't look like the norm, and was willing to experiment with something because they're like, let's just follow the Holy Spirit and see where the Holy Spirit's leading. Yeah.
Another thing I learned from Trey was not only was there cultural issues with this woman and her family, but Trey, there was also abuse that she had experienced. And Trey said with someone that's experienced abuse, what often happens is they will come near, and then as a level of comfort or intimacy develops, they pull back. And so the micro church model, so he learned about that and learned how to be patient and loving toward her. But there's that kind of flexibility in the micro church model to deal with someone wherever they're at and relate to them and just kind of be ready when it's time, God's time for them.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you saying that made me really think too about like the flip end of it, because I know a lot of times we think about micro church and then we ask ourselves, okay, well, what are we going to do with kids? Or, you know, how's this going to impact my faith? And I was thinking about, we had a church in Hoboken that started as a regular traditional church plant. The pandemic hit, it was Hoboken, so it was like New York City where it locked down quickly. And so they moved to more of a micro church model. And then through the pandemic, they made it through the pandemic, the micro churches were starting to grow, but that kind of season for that pastor there was just over. God was calling him to a different spot. So he left, but the church closed down. But one of the micro churches was like, man, what do we do now? And I was kind of like, well, you can keep doing micro church. I'll support you. We got messages online. And they're like, okay. So they started doing that. And so we connect regularly. But this group of average everyday Christians in a very post-Christian and secular area, they meet together for micro church. And I was sitting down with them and meeting and connecting when I was back in town just to see how it was going. And to hear them talk about faith, and the person that was leading the micro church used to be Catholic, and it was kind of like one of those Catholics where like I would go, but it wasn't like a huge part of my everyday life kind of thing. And to hear him talk about faith now, and like, you know, faith is in every area of his life. But the really cool thing is he'll still go to the golf course on a Sunday morning with his friends and be able to connect with them. And then they do micro church at night. And so he's able to be connected in these communities where you wouldn't normally be able to connect, because he's able to meet with people at different times. And they are in one of the most expensive cities in the country, New York City. Hoboken used to be like the cheap place to go. Now the joke is Hoboken is just the fifth borough, right? It's like just as expensive as New York City. And so like the cost of trying to like put a brick and mortar church there would be astronomical. But the church is growing there because the people that already live there, that are already passionate about that place, are now gathering together to do church and mission together. And that's kind of the powerful opportunity. It reminds me a lot of the Lower Mainland and Vancouver. It's like, yeah, if we think in our traditional form of church, it can be really hard to plant a lot of churches here because it's the same thing as it's expensive, right? And it's hard to get property, and it's not culturally a very easy place to live and thrive. But I think one of the things micro church and micro group opens up is like it moves us from a mentality where we're trying to call trained people and get them to fall in love with an area versus taking the people that already love the area and training them for ministry. If you're able to take people that already love an area and train them for ministry, the ministry will expand out much longer. Because they're already embedded there. That's like home. They want to see people reached because that's the place they grew up and the place they care about, and it's the greatest place on earth, right? And when you're from an area, you're like, this is the greatest place on earth. Why would anybody else live anywhere else, right? I'll visit somewhere else. But like in every area, there's somebody that feels like that. And so what would it look like if you could take somebody like that that's embedded and then really train them for ministry and launch it out?
Most of you know this, I'm from the prairies. And, you know, if it wasn't for the housing, it'd be really easy to get people to fall in love with the Vancouver area because you just like bring them here.
Yeah.
And I often say to Susan, we now live in a place that's like where we used to go on holidays. Yeah. So there'd always be a letdown when we came home. Yeah. Now it's like, there's no letdown when we come home. So we're in a beautiful place with beautiful people. So,
yeah. And I don't know if you all I experienced this because like it's really similar where I'm at in the sense of like it is a beautiful place and it's a place people travel to, you know, but it's also a place that has lots of fun things and opportunities to be doing other stuff, right? So like it's the same for us in New Jersey. It's like if you want to jump on the train and go into the city and see a Broadway show, you can do that. Mm-hmm. If you want to get in your car, you can drive an hour and you're in the mountains, hanging out and hiking. If you want to drive an hour down, you're at the beach. It's like, you know, people have like the world, it feels like the world at their fingertips. And I think one of the really cool things about micro groups and micro churches is the church can go there and be present there. So like you can have a group of friends that starts out just wanting to ski, you know? And you go up there and all of a sudden skiing turns into an opportunity to be able to share Jesus. And now all of a sudden you got a church on top of the ski hill. Like it's a really cool thing, right? Or the lake or the mountains or your backyard. Yeah.
So like this is what I want to do. I'm going to keep doing the things that are important I'm going to be supporting our leaders. I'm going to keep doing that. I feel that's a vital part of the work that I do. Before I was always, I believe in small groups. I think they're important, but this isn't the same as small groups. And so we've got one going on Monday nights every other week, but the rest, I want to keep open space in my calendar so that I can start micro churches, micro groups, which lead to a micro church. And so we've got one group, it's 3 couples, that's got a start date of Monday, February 13th, right?
Nice.
And we're going to get together, we're going to have a little discipleship Bible study, and then there might be some craft beer and Guitar Hero afterwards.
Ooh, Guitar Hero.
Yeah.
That'd be a good one.
Yeah, so... and then there's a young fellow that I'm going to meet with. He's away on a mission trip right now, and we've got to figure out who our third person is, and then that group will start, and we'll see what God does.
That's huge. And I want to encourage, I think it's really cool because, I mean, one, you're taking the experiment to step out and try it. And I think that's always the first hurdle, like we talked about. I remember the first time we tried one, I was just kind of burnt out doing everyday church stuff, and I'm not saying that you are, but that's where I was at, and I was like, I want to try it differently. So we just sent out an invite, and it felt like the first time I invited my friends over to hang out. I was like, man, maybe somebody's going to say, they're going to say no. But a group of people came out, and our micro church time, even though it was a shorter season, at that location was incredible. It was like one of those things where we got to see Jesus move, and we got to see Jesus move with somebody that wouldn't step into the established church. Then the second time we've launched out micro church, it was an accident. We had just started this Church at 1002 preaching series, and my in-laws came over to watch with us because we were in Florida. And after that, they're like, hey, what if we did breakfast together while we watched it? Okay. Hey, what if we do this again next week? And the next thing I know, it's a micro church. And not only is it a micro church, but it's the micro church where my kids got to experience their first communion.
Wow.
And so we got to gather together, and we got to do the Lord's Supper right there in the middle of the living room. And we got to teach our kids about it, and they got to experience that with us. It's a really cool thing. So yeah, there's just all kinds of opportunities like that can open up, and you can try. And some micro churches are going to be around for a while, and they'll grow. And some will be around for a season, but don't worry whether it's a season or whether it's a long-term thing, because you never know what God does in a season, right? Think about your own lives. How many seasons have you had where God did something really big in a short space? God can do that for other people too. Yeah.
And if we just look at the Oikos prayer maps on the wall, you could envision those as networks of microgroups.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
And some of those names might be people who might be willing to be part of a microgroup.
Oh, 100%. And I think this is cool, and this brings up a good question for you. You said that one of the things you want to do is just to be able to equip people that want to try this stuff. So what does equipping look like? And what kind of things are you going to try and make available for people or help them with to be able to help them try this out?
Well, you and I've talked about this before, about I'm like you, I'm learning as I go, right? So on the one hand, I have absolutely no idea. But on the other hand, anybody that wants to learn about the Missionary Pathway, I'd be happy to help make that happen, whether it's in person or online, so that others can, like you and I have talked about this, we're hoping that this is the start of something. So please don't, whether you're watching online or in person, please don't go, well, I went to that conference, check that off my list. I don't have to ever think about that again. My hope and my prayer, and I think you would agree with me on this, is that this would be the start of something. And so I want to, if you want to start a journey about exploring more about the Missionary Pathway, I want to be here to help you along the way. And so there's lots of different ways that could look.
Yeah, and I think that's huge, and it's cool because Like even when James was going through, full disclosure, as James was going through, we started the cohort when we had it like 75% done. And 75% is generous. But we were like, if we start the cohort, then we'll definitely get the rest of it done, because eventually the cohort's going to get to the point where they need the new content. And so as we were like putting it all together and it was all coming up, we decided at the very last we needed one session, because what tends to happen in our church kind of context is we do something like this and we're like, that was great. Where's the next Bible study? Where's the next workshop? And so really what we've been talking about all weekend and what you do in the Missionary Pathway is just a series of practices that you begin to live out. And as you've seen this weekend, they're not like incredibly complicated things. They're simple, but it's simple things done over time that can make the biggest impact. And so the way we structured this pathway is when you walk through it, you're actually the best person to take somebody else through it. And so it goes a session, you do like a session, and then you connect on it. And then after that, you just try it. And then when you're done trying it, you go to the next session. And once you watch that, you connect on it. And it's all online, really easy to follow. And so like if you were to connect with James, what you would do is you'd go through the content, and then you all would sit down together and have a discussion, connect on questions, and then talk about how you're going to try it. And then when you're done trying it, you come back and you try the next thing. And then by the time you get to the end of it, you're like, hey, that wasn't so bad. And now I'm trying some things I hadn't tried before. So lead somebody else through it. And that's also the reason we made the actual training part free. Because we want no barrier for you to just walk somebody through it. So the training part will always be free for you to access and run other people through. Yeah.
And if you're here and you're a church worker, or if you're online watching and you're a church worker, what you can do is you can go through the Missionary Pathway yourself and then start leading your people through it.
Yeah.
Offer it to them, and if they want, take them through it.
Yeah, and if you're in that spot and you need help with that, you can just connect with me. And we'll set up a time, and we do some of these like clergy catalyst things where we'll walk you through the pathway and help you walk somebody else through it. Yeah. Are there any questions like left over that you all have for me or Pastor James? Or
And please use the microphone just so we can capture it with the live stream. Should I check see if there's anything texted in?
Oh, yeah.
Nope.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Still right. Cool.
Oh, you know what? We forgot. Would you be willing to share what it was like to eat poutine for the very first time?
Oh, yeah. It blew away my expectations. I loved it.
We had it with pulled pork, right?
Yeah, we had it with pulled pork, and I've learned a little trick. We were at a restaurant, and the waiter comes over, and I'm like, I want to try the poutine. He's like, okay, how do you want it? And I just said, how should I want it? Like, what would you suggest? And so he's like, I always get it with the pulled pork. I'm like, done. And he brings this out, and it's like the French fries with the pulled pork covered in like the gravy. It was so delicious. And and we split it. It was really good. And I was describing this to my wife, and she goes, what is poutine? I was like, well, it's like French fries and like pulled pork and like gravy. And she goes, so it's fried stuff and gravy? She's like, of course that sounds good. So it was fun. But it was also like a cool kind of missional experience. It's like, you can step into new places and you don't have to have it figured out. You just ask the people that are around you. They're usually more than willing to share, especially in the case of poutine.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, this has been really fun. For me, a highlight was just getting to see the conversations that are happening, getting to see the wall of just people to pray for. And I just want to encourage you, whenever we end a session, we always end a session with what we call an I will statement. And one of the different things that we do is we shut the camera off and the audio off, and we just take a few minutes to write a really simple I will statement out of what God's been doing. And an I will statement is something that just passes what we like to call the Hey Mom test. And you're like, what's the Hey Mom test? The Hey Mom test is this. Hey Mom, watch me jump off the roof, right? Hey Mom, watch me ride my bike. Hey Mom. It's like one of those things where it's very actionable, and you could look at somebody and say, hey, watch me do this. Hey Mom, watch me make an oikos prayer mob. Hey Mom, watch me go out into my community and just ask some questions of people around me. Hey Mom, watch me actually put a date on my calendar for when I'm going to invite my friends over. So what I would like you all to do right now as we come out of this is take just a few minutes, like 1 or 2 minutes here, and I want you to just think about what your I will statement is. And, write that down somewhere in front of you. What did you hear the Spirit of God encouraging you to do? And then once you've written that down, we'll take a few minutes in silence, and then I'll encourage you to take just a little bit of time to maybe, if you want to, you don't have to, but to share that with some of the people at your table. And then we'll wrap up in prayer, if that sounds good. Yeah. Cool. All right, so take a few minutes to just silently yourself write down, what is your I will statement? Coming out of this weekend, I will what?